Welcome to my research project, guys. Super quickly, I want to say that I really enjoyed the videos that we did in class for our discussions, and that kind of inspired me to do a video for this research project. Which, to be honest, I wasn't entirely sure if that's what I was gonna do. At the beginning, I did just, was just gonna write an essay about the research that I'd done and the answers that I came up with and how why you should care, whatever, blah 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 blah. But then inside of the assignment instructions, reading about the ideas that Dr. Blair gave us, it included something that said a mixed method or a creative project of your own design. So right then and there, I knew for sure that I'd be doing a video. And so one more quick disclaimer, because there is going to be a lot of information and talking to do in this video, um, and from my lack of being efficient in it, I do have notes in front of me, um, and so I'm probably going to be reading from those every once in a while, or so if for some reason I'm on screen and I'm looking around, that's probably why. Um, and really quickly again, one more thing, I do want to present. The style of this video is not just a discussion, but I kind of want it to be like a YouTube video, because I've seen plenty of YouTube videos where it's kind of like a research project, and so I think overall it just hooks the audience and it keeps their attention longer. So with the goal of providing some information to anyone who watches this video, I want to make it hopefully somewhat enjoyable. Um, but with that being said, making a video isn't easy, and it's very different from any approach I've ever done. Um, so I'm not sure if I'm gonna accomplish all my own goals of creating something enjoyable. But yeah, I mean, with all that said, I hope y'all enjoy, and I hope you guys can take something from this video. And yeah, I hope y'all enjoy. So, for as long as humanity has formed communities, culture has followed them. And the stories of those cultures have been coupled with them. These stories, they share narratives that have affected cultural values, behaviors, and they shape the future of any given society. But when it comes to these cultural stories, I personally have a few questions. Number one being, do the allegories and national myths and folktales shape our moral values? And when we look honestly at these allegories within them, do they reflect beliefs about needing God, or at the very least, a higher power? I think my answer to both of these questions, just reading them, is yes. As I see it, allegory serves as the hand by which national myths and folktales give their moral values. They take seemingly abstract ethical ideas and they turn them into something authentic. They give memorable narratives that shape individuals and cultural behavior. But even with that being said, and even with the substitution of divine authority sometimes being attributed to humankind, these stories reveal a cultural need for something more than self given moral grounding. I'm aware that it's not enough for me to just say what I believe and, hope that makes sense. So that's what this video is for. And honestly, that's what the whole research was for. Um, my goal is to explain how I came to the answers that I did and offer evidence that I find for them. But before I continue, I want to acknowledge that I myself have beliefs, and my faith shaped the way I listen and the lens from which I view things. Um, Before we get into the stories and my question at hand, let me just explain how we got to this topic. So, originally, my goal was to explore 5 different cultures from around the world, see what kind of cultural stories they have, and how they played a role in the morals that that culture has, or even if they believe in God. So, um, after starting the research, I quickly realized that it was way more than I can accomplish. I think I had my hands full with just one culture, so 5 was a little ambitious, especially for how much time I needed to set aside for finding good stories, finding examples of how those stories affected morals, and the allegories within them. So it just wasn't going to happen with my current schedule, and so I decided that I would move to one country. And so I decided on the country that I would be using as my only country would be the median that I had when I was going to do five different cultures or five different countries. So it would be the only one I'm doing now. It wasn't leaning too much one way or the other um, on its belief or reliance on God, and it was really rich with cultural stories. And this country was Japan. So I came to the conclusion of these five different cultures and this as my median, and eventually picking it as my only country thanks to the article of Religion and Morality by Ryan McKay. It was providing the answers that I was looking for and provided a table that was super helpful. And next, I needed stories. So I set out looking for stories that actually were used to justify moral actions, whether that person, whether that was personal or even a large scale movement. And the stories that I landed on, the cultural stories that I landed on, um, were Peach Boy, Fisherman in the Dragon Palace, The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, and 1 Inch Boy. And of course, these are the English names. They're Japanese stories, but I'm just giving you the English names. Um, Now, let me explain one more thing before we move on. And I know this is a lot, but it's important that I share, I guess, the evolution, if you will, of the question, because it wasn't always the same. It changed so many times between my first idea and where we are now in the video. It's important for me to say again um, that I love cultures. I'm passionate about them, and I love hearing about them, hearing the stories. And so I decided to start with that, something pretty broad. I feel like. And so my first question was, how do the stories we hear in different parts of the world affect how we make our decisions? Pretty broad, but I think by itself, pretty good question. But I knew that I needed to satisfy the other things that I'm a part of, which is the major of English and, something that I'm also passionate about, English. And so I thought about how I could improve this question to incorporate both parts and present a research project that was high quality, covers both the topics of English and culture, is easy to follow, and was reasonable for me to complete given my schedule restraints. So eventually that leads me to the question, how do the allegories in national myths and folk tales shape our moral values? And when we look honestly at how the allegories within them work, do they reflect beliefs about needing God? So, where do these questions lead us? Well, personally, it led me straight to the stories themselves. And to really be able to answer these questions and understand how the allegories within them actually did play a part in moral decision making for even whole nations, we need to understand the stories themselves. So that brings us to summaries. So, for the sake of not having to read the entire story in this video, I'm going to give a hopefully quick but helpful rundown. Let's call it efficient. I want to start these summaries with a summary of Peach Boy, also called Momotaro. So, to start the summaries, I'm going to start off with Peach Boy, also known as Momotaro. And they're the same name, different language, so I kind of go in between using each of them sometimes. It just depends. But, anyways, Peach Boy, it's set in like the Edo period, which is 1603 to 1868. And basically, it follows an elderly woodcutter and his wife who had no children and lived by a river, right? So one day, the older lady was washing clothes and she saw a giant peach floating down the stream of the river. And basically, she lets her husband know, and they grab it and they take it home. And because it's a big old peach, they try to eat it. But, it just randomly just opens or splits by itself, and a little baby boy was inside of it. And even though it's kind of weird, like, that's strange. Why would that? Why would a little baby be inside of inside of a peach. They were just happy to have him, and they named him Momotaro, which is Peach Boy. And so they raised him as their own child. Um, anyways, Peach Boy grows extremely fast and becomes super strong, thoughtful, and brave. And at this point, he still is a child, but yeah, he's growing really fast. Um, and one day he hears about the Onis or the ogres, and some of the translations call them demons, who lived on distant Onigashima, which is the Ogre Island. They were selling to the mainland, where Peach Boy is from. They were plundering villages, kidnapping people, and just stealing all kinds of treasures, right? Kind of seem like, they're called ogres, but they kind of seem like pirates to me. And so Peach Boy was really angry at this, either way. Doesn't matter who they were. So he announced that he would go to punish the ogres by himself and bring peace to the land, right? That's what he declares. And obviously his parents try to stop him at least a little bit, but eventually they kind of just give up. And so the old woman makes him a batch of kibidongos, which is a sweet millet dumplings, to take on his journey. And if you don't know what that looks like, hopefully at this point I'm putting pictures and stuff up to help tell the story, because I don't know how. I mean, hopefully my summary is good. um, but either way, Peach Boy takes off with the swords and armors and the dumplings. They kind of just kitted him out for his journey. And as he's on the road, he meets a dog who's threatening to bite him, right? But Peach Boy calmly offers him a kibidongo, and the dog ate it. And I don't know if it's magically, or if just the idea of being thoughtful and sharing. Either way, it becomes friendly, and it decided to help him on his journey. Um, and then a little further along, a monkey comes along, and he tries to steal the remaining dumplings. But after I guess just hashing it out a little bit, Peach Boy gives him one, and he too becomes a companion. Someone to join the journey. And finally, they run into one more animal on the way to Onigashima, or Ogre Island, and that is a pheasant that had been watching from the trees, and he also accepted a dumpling and decided to join them on their journey. Um, so eventually, the four of them are all traveling together, and they go on a boat to Onigashima. And when they arrive, the ogres were already drunk. They were partying, real happy, with the spoils of not, I mean, probably not war, but of their conquest. Um, you know, Either way, they get in there, and the pheasant flew in first, and he goes and pecks the eyes of the guards, and the dog bites people, and the monkey claws people's faces. And while all that's happening, Peach Boy storms in with his swords, and after, losing so many people, the chief of the ogre, or the person in charge, is at that point begging for mercy, right? And surrenders all the treasure, with which included like magical jewels, golden helmets, and just a bunch of treasure. Literally, just a bunch of treasure. Um, and after that, eventually, Peach Boy ties up the chief and loads the treasure onto the ships that belong to the ogres, and he sailed home with his new three animal friends, living happily ever after. And actually, the old couple that lived with him also lived happily ever after the rest of their days. And the story ends with Peach Boy becoming a legendary hero throughout all of Japan. And it's a very classic, like, hero archetype of story, right? And so that's a really quick summary of it. So let's get through the meanings and lessons. So meanings and lessons. So, like, what's the meaning and the lesson of this story? I think the story is unique in the fact that it's so simple. It's it's a simple story of a hero, and it shows like courage, righteousness through the acts of a young boy who's willing to stand up to ogres who are doing wrong in his homeland. Right? It shows like, hey, even the smallest person can stand up to someone who's doing wrong to your community and where you're from. Because he was, even though he's like kind of like a divine figure or whatever, because I mean, born of a peach, he him and three random animals, they go, they pull up to the Onigashima, and they kind of just force them to stop, and they take out a bunch of the Oni. So um yeah, and it doesn't just show that, it also shows teamwork, and the fact that all the animals were working together. Momotaro worked with them, and that working in such a way, proves that each part together as a whole is worth more than just the sum of their parts. Because individually, they're just a pheasant, a monkey, a dog, and a little kid. Um, but they come together and they do something remarkable. So the next part is, does it point towards God? And this answers one half of the question that I pose for all of these stories. Personally, I don't think that this particular cultural story points towards the belief in God. Um, as the story goes, it for the most part is just about humans and their own journey. Um, I do, when you read a lot of reviews about it, which I did. A lot of people consider Momotaro to be something divine. Even though it's kind of, I understand, because it's like nobody is just born of a peach, right? But that wasn't the main point of the story. Like, his birth being from a peach isn't really the main point. And so I think, considering that, yeah, I would say that this particular cultural story doesn't really point towards belief in God, but rather something about teamwork and the act of one person, and a simple hero story, really. So while some people might consider Momotaro or Peach Boy to be something divine, truly it's unclear as to what he is. However, I will say this, though. I do think that it is clear that the allegories within the cultural story, you know, they can be and they were used to justify certain moral or immoral actions. So this leads me to um, the first part of the question, and for this, it's kind of changed up a little bit. But how were the allegories of Peach Boy used to justify moral or immoral actions? So, get into that first part of the question that I stated earlier. So, from the early 1930s, which is like Imperial Japan era, um, Momotaro was embedded, or Peach Boy was embedded in state-approved school textbooks across all grades. It taught the themes of bravery, loyalty, and conquest, right? And of course, this time period is also like World War II time, or what I'm saying, the World Wars, and the story itself was retold to frame Japan as like the little Peach Boy, or Momotaro, who was brave enough to fight the Oni, right? And the Oni was symbolizing the Western powers, like the Americas and British and their Asian colonies as oppressed allies. Like everything played a part in everything inside of the story plays a part in what's happening in real life for them. And so, by 1945, the story itself was in all kinds of classrooms, and the point of it was to build unquestioning, or like unrealizing allegiance to the emperor and the war itself, really trying to justify the war. While Momotaro is a great simple hero story that can help with your morals, it can help you believe in yourself, and maybe that, especially like in team sports, you could probably be told this story of like, hey, it's kind of like a David versus Goliath type of story, right? Which, if you've ever done sports, you hear it quite a bit. A classic a David versus Goliath situation. But in this scenario, it was used for immoral reasons, right? And so I guess A quick recap, just to emphasize this even more: how it shapes moral values. It reinforces the ideal of righteous warriors who fight for the nation slash, the emperor. It taught that loyalty, teamwork, and sharing resources creates victory. It made conquest of the Oni appear morally good, and so how I said earlier, the Oni represents Western civilizations in this point, and so and that's not the only historical real life examples. Of course, like I said, Imperial Japan, 1930s to 1945s. Peach Boy became, a really important propaganda symbol, of the Japanese militarism. Right? It was just huge for the military, and so with that being said, there was also elementary school textbooks that showed Momotaro as how a Japanese soldier should be. There was animated films all throughout that time period, that portrayed Japanese pilots as, the animals attacking Pearl Harbor, which was like Onigashima, and I think it's just there's different ways that this could be used to yeah, there's just different ways that this can be used to justify any kind of action, right? So that's moral or immoral actions. And so yeah, I think that answers. I think that those examples that I gave you, I think that answers the question that I originally had. It says, how do the allegories in national myths and folktales shape our moral values? Right. I We take what happens in those stories, we see the symbolism within it, and we apply it to our lives. And so something simple like this, it's, I guess you would say, it's a little abstract, and so we can kind of apply it to a lot of things. And in this case, it was used for militarism, and I think, while unfortunate, that kind of answers the question for that. All right, and so just to kind of get through, not to spend too much time on one story, because I did do four. We're gonna go ahead and move on. And so the next one is called Urashima Taro, which in English is the Fisherman and the Dragon Palace. I'm going to be saying a lot of these things in English just because, or where I can say names in English, just because if not, I'm going to be completely butchering everything. So, yeah, let's get to it. Okay, so Urashima Taro is described as an honest working young fisherman who lived alone by the sea. And one day he saw a group of children messing with a small turtle, right? And he stops them by paying them some money to leave it alone. Eventually, he gets the turtle back into the ocean and sends it off. A day passes by, and he goes back out fishing again. He's out into the sea, and suddenly a huge turtle appears, and it speaks in a human voice. Strange. And yeah, the turtle says, "Hey, you saved me yesterday," which is weird because he was small the first day, huge the second day. And he tells him that he's the servant of a dragon king of the sea. And so basically, after that, he tells him that the princess wants to thank him personally. And so he tells him to get on his back, and he's gonna take him to where they are. And so he carries him into the ocean and brings him to what is called the Ryugu Jo, which is the Dragon Palace, right? And it's described as a realm of coral halls, pearl roofs, and it has a garden of glowing sea anemones, right? And so there he meets the princess, right, who's described as extremely beautiful, and she thanks him for what he did. And while he was there, the time just went by super quick, right? He's having a good time, and he doesn't realize that the days are turning into weeks, weeks into months, and the whole time he's just having a good time, eating, listening to music, dancing, just exploring what their days are like. And eventually, being there so long, he falls in love with the princess. But even though he meets someone that he loves and the place is beautiful, right, he still gets homesick. and he tells the princess that he must return to visit his parents, and he makes a promise to her saying that he's gonna come back soon. So yeah, he's promising to come back soon, and the princess is sad, but either way, he said he would come back soon, and so she gave him a treasure box, which has like a silk cord tied around it, and she gave him the warning: never open this box, or you will never return here. Right? And of course, she wants him to return. He promises to return, and so he makes the promise he won't open it, and the turtle that brought him there in the first place takes him back to land. And so here we are. He's back out of the ocean. He's on the land, and he recognizes that, or he realizes that everything is different. The village looks different. His home's not where it was. He asks people about his family. No one recognizes who he is, or his name or anything like that. And so he finally talks to an old man, and the old man says that, he repeats his name back to him: Urashima Taro. He disappeared into the sea 300 years ago. And so, understandably so, he's in shock, right? And so Urashima realizes that the time inside of the Dragon Palace flowed differently, right? So, while only 3 years, is what it says, passed under the water, he was under there for 3 whole years. During that time, 300 years passes on land. And, of course, he's upset, he's sad, feels alone because everything's different. 300 years passes, and I'm sure there's probably technology new that he didn't even recognize. And so, after some time passes, he forgets about the princess's warning, and he opens the treasure box. And basically, when he opens it, white smoke comes out, and just like the flip of a switch, his hair turns white, his back basically breaks. He becomes a frail old man, right? And some versions say that he turns into a crane and flew back to the palace, and he's just separated from the princess forever. But the one that I read, it just simply ended with him being sad on the shore. But either way, yeah, his basically returned after 3 years of being under the water, and finds out that his past life is just completely gone. So, what are the meanings and the lessons used here in this story? I guess the best way for me to describe this tale is the word poignant. It's not a word I use really often, but I feel like it just works here. It's a tale about being caught between wanting two things, and the danger of losing either one. Especially when it comes to time, right? Because that's something a lot of people can relate to. It's just you just can't turn the clock back. He can't go back to his parents from 300 years ago, and now that he's opened the box, he can't even go back to the princess after spending 3 years with her and falling in love, right? And so that's one of the lessons. It's about not being able to get back the time that you've lost, and the danger for longing for something that's lost, or the danger of longing for something that you can't have, right? And I would also say that, one of the meanings here is showing the boundary between, where you're living, which is the human world, and the divine world, because those two things, especially in this story, they operate differently, right? And I would say the last lesson is, it warns against the curiosity that disobeys the warnings that someone gives. Like, here she tells him not to open the treasure box if you ever want to see me again, and he does it anyways, and he can't see her. So, to the questions, the main reason we're reading the cultural stories, or these stories, does it point towards God? Firstly, we'll answer this question: does it point towards God? Again, this tale does not directly refer to the Christian God or Judeo-Christian God, but the undersea palace is what is called a kami realm, or a divine place, and the princess is supposed to be like a goddess. This story It reflects Shinto ideas, right? It shows otherworldly realms that humans usually can't visit, and they just don't belong there. Um, but even with that being said, I think even though it's not referring to like a Christian God or the Christian God, um, one thing that came up a lot in, or maybe not a lot, but some things that was on my mind a lot while I was researching it, was the discussions that I found online. And well, these aren't academic discussions. They're just anybody who reads the stories and gives their thoughts and opinions. Some people, they said it reminds them of the Adam and Eve story, which represents like something divine or a paradise lost through disobedience. And while this isn't, like I said, while this isn't an academic source, I think it's important to recognize that sometimes people can draw similarities from these kinds of cultural folk tales or stories to something that you can find in the Bible. So I think like I said, it's not academic, but it's something to look at. I think these are interesting. I think that these stories, even for people who may not be Christian or even religious at all in any way, can still take some kind of lesson from this story. Okay. So, for the next part of the question, how were the allegories of Oroshima Taro or the Fisherman in the Dragon Palace used to justify moral or immoral actions? So, of course, there were some practical, real life things that happen uh, where people use these kinds of stories to teach a lesson or things like that. And this one is different, quite different from Momotaro, which was the first story we heard, where you know they're in Momotaro's shoes, but here we're more so learning from the the actions of someone else who isn't us. And so I think for the Fisherman in the Dragon Palace, there are some very interesting uses for this story to teach morals. For example, in Japanese schools, there are classes specifically for moral studies, and the stories such as this one, they're used to teach students about not opening what was called the tamatabako in the story, and that's the little jewelry box. And more or less, the story is used as like a cautionary tale to keep students and people in general to cherish what they have and not chase after them. So just chase after things that are not meant for them. And that's kind of how these allegories in this story was used. This justifies that moral or immoral action. And so another thing that's pretty interesting that I found really quickly is it's a comparison that I found while researching. um, some people, and this is from the book The Atomic Bomb: Voices from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. um, the opening of the Tamatabako was compared to the dropping of the atomic bombs. Right? It says like where the U.S. Air Force did drop millions of general propaganda leaflets over Japanese cities for months, warning civilians about air raids and encouraging them to evacuate and pressure their leaders to surrender. Unfortunately, we know the results of that situation, but what I thought was interesting was the comparison of not listening to maybe a warning or an advice, and in not listening, you get a certain outcome that nobody really wants. I think, and so, or like getting an outcome where you can't win um in any capacity. And so I think that this story has very interesting, the use of the allegories in this story, or even the lessons, and even the meanings and the lessons of this story are very interesting. They're you know I'm not going to get into the other stories just yet, but in this one, but yeah, it's very different. And so I think it's worth talking about. And yeah, that's the Fisherman in the Dragon Palace. And so for the next summary, and to answer the questions, we're going to be moving on to the next tale that I really like, this one is my favorite out of all of them. It's called The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. So I know I said there would be more stories, but due to the length of this video at this point, um, this is the conclusion. And to conclude this video, and the research that I've been doing for a long time, that probably requires even more time from me. Um, I just want to say that I just want to say a few things, but starting off, I want to say that I know that even already there was a lot that went into answering the question, that really was the main part of this research, right? Or this research project. And it could have been much more simpler as far as saying yes to both the, as far as answering the questions and leaving it at that, providing just a little bit of evidence, a little bit of evidence here and there, a little bit of examples here, some real world application there. But the point was for me to find real world examples and show evidence for the answers that I'm providing in depth. And so that's why, there was so much to this project. And originally it started off much more bigger, with much more topics, with much more countries and much more stories. But there's only so much time to work on it, and so it got much smaller, and probably it got thinned out more than I would like, because there was still more to share, and I think some of the stories I really enjoyed. But anyways, before I get on too much of a tangent, I want to move on. Quickly, I want to share why I chose to work with allegories. I chose this literary device, mostly to show just how much English as a mode or a system can affect the world, right? Not just the English language, but in its entirety. Something so small, something so simple, or seemingly so small, seemingly so simple, that's inside of a cultural story. It's affecting only one culture at that point, technically. It can literally affect the whole world. And so to answer the question one more time, yes, allegories can shape our moral values, and they do that in so many different ways. And that's why I felt that there was a need to go in depth with each story, to show examples in each story, to show real world applications of this story in terms of the allegories being presented to people and that changing people's morals. And I think that even just with the two stories that I shared, we can see that that there's a difference between the two, Momotaro and Urashima Taro, I believe. One was very, a heroic story that gave pride to a country, and it was used for militarism. And then you look at the other one, and it was more of a silent cautionary tale, and you can see that there was change in the way a whole culture thinks, even in the silent tale, just because in the real world application that I was telling you about it, in I don't know exactly how I explained it because that part of the video was filmed yesterday, but in that silent changer, in the silent change, it was used inside of curriculum for schools. It was used in curriculum, not just for anything, but for actual moral studies. So, with those two things being said, and I don't want to take up too much time because I'm looking at the clock already, or how long I've been recording already. Sorry, my cat is just going crazy because I won't let her play with this cup. Yeah, I at this point I'm just gonna end it. And so, with that being said, I really hope that I did this topic justice. I know for a fact that it feels incomplete for me because of how much more I wanted to share and how much more research that I did that just really could not be shared due to time restraints. And personally, I wish I had more time. But anyways, yeah, it requires a lot, but I'm very thankful to have had the opportunity to make this my project and turn this into Dr. Blair, who did a great job teaching this whole semester. And so, yeah, if you were able to watch the whole video, you're probably watching this, or if you if you skipped a little bit around, that's totally fine because it was really long. But either way, to Dr. Blair, I really appreciate you being my professor for this semester, and yeah, it's been a pleasure working on this project, and thank you for watching. Bye bye.